Melusine by Lynne Banks. Chapter 3. Coffee from a Bowl. His mother had already laid a rickety old iron table outdoors on the rough grass. "Oh, hello, darling. So there you are. Been exploring?" She greeted him, emerging from the kitchen door with a tray of bowls and plates. "Isn't this lovely? Though I can't say I'd call this a garden. Still, the sun makes up for a lot." "God, these accursed flies!" Roger heard his father exclaiming from indoors. A series of exasperated whacks indicated that he was laying about him with a rolled-up newspaper. "Stop doing that, Brian," Roger's mother called. "The dead ones will only attract more. I swear there are fewer outdoors than in." "Gotcha," was the only answer. He appeared, examining his kill on the newspaper with satisfaction. "4 at a blow." "Brilliant," remarked his mother. "Keep it up. At that rate you'll get rid of them all in about 900 years. Can you bring the teapot and the marmalade?" "Where are the twins?" asked Roger, sitting down on a rusty garden chair and pulling the cornflakes towards him. "Need you ask? Fast asleep. Sorry, there's no proper milk." "Can you drink goat's milk?" "Why do you ask?" "Because they've got them here, loads of them." "Goats!" cried his father, coming out with the tea. "So that's it. This must be a sort of farm. I thought so. The smell, not to mention the flies. You'd think the agency would have mentioned that. Chateau, indeed." "Well, it is a real chateau," said his mother. "Just amazingly run down, that's all. I wonder why." Could Monsieur Sirpe really be in such bad straits that he has to eke out a living as well as a peasant farmer? That's pretty well what he looked like, I must say. The agent said he owned the place. He doesn't look like my idea of a Chateaubriand, certainly. "What's that?" asked Roger. "A Chateaubriand's the owner of a chateau. One expects them to be rather grand, like dukes." Roger's father had a swig of tea, went into the flat, and returned, after a moment, looking at a sheet of paper. "Magnificent! Ha ha! Chateau de Beausepé. Well, there's the name, all right. In the heart of the Vendée, one of the most historic regions of France." "What does that mean, historic regions? Is it older than unhistoric regions?" asked Roger. His parents laughed. "As a matter of fact, it's younger. Parts of the Vendée used to be under the sea." Roger stopped eating and looked at his father. Was he kidding him? But he seemed quite serious. "Historic just means that a lot has happened here. Most of it probably violent. That's what makes history, usually wars." He continued reading from the sheet of paper. "The chateau has been in the same family for 300 years, since pre-revolutionary times." He read on in silence. "Funny," he said at last. "It sounded so attractive when we read about it in Manchester. Perhaps anything south of Watford sounds attractive from Manchester in mid-January." He put the paper down and reached for some crisp bread. "Don't you like it here?" Roger asked rather anxiously. For some reason he wanted his parents to like it. His father pulled down the corners of his mouth. "It's different from expectations somehow. Our flat's all right." "Our flat, as you call it, is gorgeous," said his mother firmly. "Worth every penny to feel like a duchess for 2 weeks." "Like a chatelaine, you mean?" said his father. "Just the same, I wish I'd known that our part would be the only bit of the place that hasn't been allowed to rack and ruin." "But isn't there something intriguing about that?" asked Roger's mother. I'll never forget the contrast between that dreadful kitchen with all its filth and squalor and the fabulous beauty of our apartment." "I thought that too," said Roger eagerly. "I think it's very fabulous." "It's got Monsieur Sirpe for an ogre, and his daughter is the sort of Cinderella." His parents focused attention on him. "Have you met her, the daughter?" "Yeah, just now." "What's she like?" "What do you mean, Cinderella?" "Well, an outdoor one. She's a milkmaid." They gazed at him expectantly. "She milks the goats, dozens of them, by herself, and she knows which ones she's done, although they're all running loose." "Good God!" exclaimed his father. "What?" "The Chatelain's daughter, a goatherd. How are the mighty fallen?" Roger frowned. He felt as if his parents were somehow looking down their noses at his new friend, if Melusine could be called that. "How do you mean, mighty fallen?" "It's just a way of saying that once the family was probably pretty well off and grand. Landed gentry, I mean, if they owned all this in its heyday, and probably most of the land around here as well, and now look what they've come down to. Having to keep goats and take summer visitors. Probably all the gracious living stuff in our flat is the remains of old decency, as the Irish say. They've taken every item that was any good, that had survived, and put it all together in our part of the building, and modernized it, and advertised it. They let it out to summer visitors in a way of earning money, to keep the place from falling down altogether. Only I should think they've left it a bit late. His father's long-winded explanation tended to numb Roger's concentration, but he did his best to listen this time. You mean Monsieur Serpais and Melusine were once rich? I doubt it. I mean their ancestors. This place has taken several generations getting into this condition. What did you call her? Asked his mother. Melusine. What an unusual name. I wonder what her sister's called. Has she got a sister? So the father said she lives away from home, apparently. Maybe you're right about it being an intriguing setup, said his father to his mother. I'd love to see over the place. Roger's father was a dentist, but his hobby was history, as Roger knew only too well. He suppressed a sigh. He hoped it wasn't going to be one of those holidays like they'd often had at home, chosen by their father for the historic associations, old buildings, museums, and Roman ruins in the neighborhood. All too seldom did one actually see anything really interesting in one of these places, even though his father knew all sorts of things about everything, which occasionally struck a spark in Roger, if not in the twins. But Roger wasn't keen on the idea of enforced trips around old buildings. The bit of paper which Roger had read in England had also mentioned wonderful coastal beaches and a huge mass of canals somewhere near, as well as artificial lakes where you could do water sports. He thought it rather sinister that, rereading the agent's blurb now, his father had left all that part out. What about the lakes? He asked, following this train of thought. Lakes? Murmured his father, who had produced a guidebook from somewhere and was reading it while eating. We must go to the village this morning, he said to Roger's mother. I can't wait to get my teeth into a good baguette and try the local cheeses, not to mention wine. At approximately 89 pence a bottle. We can have some at every meal. This time Roger sighed without restraint. Now they were starting about food. Food was fine, but the way his parents went on about it, you'd have thought it was a religion or something. Bread was bread and cheese was cheese. And if what he'd swallowed last night in Monsieur Serpais' kitchen was a sample of the wine, he'd stick to Coke. He stood up. So we won't be going to the lake or the sea today, he said resignedly. Not just the first day, darling. We want to explore around here first. Don't you want to come to the village with us? No, thanks. I'll hang around here. He picked up his empty bowl and spoon and went indoors, where he met Emma shuffling about sleepily in her nightie. Those rotten flies were crawling all over my face, she complained. They woke me up. Good for them, said Roger. I've been up for hours. You would, said Emma sourly, as if getting up early was a perversion of nature. Polly, of course, was occupying the bathroom, wailing because there was no hot water. She had a bath every single day, sometimes twice, and was constantly washing her hair. She was quite weird. Roger wandered through into the big room. By daylight, it was even more glamorous than at night. The great octagonal table on its single stem leg shone like a mass of jewels in the streaming sunlight. There was a big stone fireplace in here, with a fantastic carved stone surround like a like in a baronial hall. It must be back to back with the one in the Serpais' kitchen. Roger tried the intervening door, but it was locked. On impulse, he clambered over the stone sill of the big leaded window and moved along the outside of the building. He was in the front now, to the next window along. He peered in through cupped hands. Yes, it was the big old ogre's kitchen. Cobwebs and dust obscured his view, but he could see a bit because the room ran the whole width of the chateau, and there was another window at the other end. There was the long table, and sitting at it were Monsieur Serpais and Melusine eating their breakfast. Feeling bold because he'd met her, he tapped on the window. Monsieur Serpais leaped to his feet and spun around. Roger saw him reach out his right hand toward the fireplace, but when he saw Roger, he let it fall. Melusine was sitting looking at him. She had a bowl in both hands, which she seemed to be lifting toward her mouth. Was that how the French ate cereal? Monsieur Serpais came reluctantly and opened the window a crack. Bonjour, monsieur, said Roger hopefully. Qu'est-ce que tu veux? Growled the man. Puis-je entrer? Emménage maintenant, he answered in a surly tone and turned on his heel, but he didn't close the window, and Roger threw his leg over the sill and climbed in. The first thing he noticed was a gun, a heavy hunting rifle leaning against the stone front of the fireplace. So that was what Monsieur Serpais had been reaching for. Roger had better watch out. With the ogre, it might be a question of shooting first and asking questions later. He sat down gingerly on a hard chair, its seat blackened with the grime of years, next to Melusine. "Hello?" he said shyly. She glanced at him out of her round eyes. The bowl, he saw, was full of milky coffee, and she was dipping the rounded end of a very thin, crusty white loaf into it. "Tu veux du café?" He didn't think he did, but he was pleased she'd offered and said, "Oui, merci." "Oui, merci." She got up and fetched another of the thick, blue-striped bowls and poured milky coffee into it from a huge jug. Then she broke off a stick of bread for him. He dipped it and bent to catch the soggy part in his mouth. To his surprise, it was perfectly delicious. Watching what she did, he took the bowl in both hands. It felt lovely and smooth and hot. He carried it to his mouth and drank the stuff. "Bon!" he exclaimed appreciatively, emerging with a coffee mustache. Some of it had spilled on his T-shirt. She suddenly smiled, picked up a filthy dishcloth, and wiped his front. Monsieur Serpais, who had been watching them, finished his meal in silence and then got up and left. Melusine stood up too and began collecting the most recently used dishes. A most useful French word now popped into Roger's head. It had been in the last vocabulary he'd had to learn before the end-of-year tests. It was the word for washing up. "Puis-je t'aider avec les vaisselles?" he asked carefully. She understood. She shook her head and carried the dishes to a distant sink. It was not like the stainless steel ones Roger was used to. It was a deep, thick white one, big enough to wash a goat in. She started rinsing the bowls rather carelessly under the crude splash of the one, presumably cold, tap. A big old brass one. Roger sidled up behind her, preparing a French sentence. "Je vous vois le chateau?" he said hopefully. She turned and gave him an odd look. He thought she was pleased. He wanted to see over her home, but then her face closed and she turned away. "Rien à voir, nothing to see." "There must be," he said. "C'est si grand. Il y a beaucoup de chambres, n'est-ce pas?" "Fermés." "All the other rooms are closed?" he asked disbelievingly. This was obviously a put-off. They must sleep somewhere for a start. She hesitated. "Peut-être pastel mais..." Roger waited. After a moment, when she didn't go on, he flushed awkwardly and said, "It's okay then, sans for rien," which was what his grandfather used to say when he meant it doesn't matter. Melusine licked her lips, turned back to the sink, stacked the bowls without drying them on a shelf, and suddenly electrified him by announcing, "I show you one big room. Et bien fini." His face broke into a great grin. "You speak English? Very, very bad. Bien alors." Roger had to restrain himself from jumping about with pleasure. Melusine was already leaving the room. He followed her, marveling at the way she moved. He hadn't noticed it in the goat pen this morning because of the uneven ground. Now as she walked ahead of him down the stone corridor, it was as if she glided on wheels into the shadows and at the corner vanished. He hurried after her. And that is the end of chapter 3.